Alright guys, welcome to RC Mojo. This week, well, a couple of days ago, I was at the model shop for a couple of servos. I got an HS81 to replace one that I drowned a couple of months ago, and I got a little Savox for another project. While at the shop though, I had one of those moments and ended up coming out with an FTX Outlaw. It's a four-wheel drive truck with a solid rear axle and independent front. It's a fairly speedy truck rather than a crawler, so it's going to fill a gap in the fleet. The main thing though is that this time of year it's waterproof, or at least that's what it says on the box. The truck's been around for a couple of years now, and generally it's quite well thought of. It's only available ready to run, which is a bit of a pain, but you can find the truck for as little as 120 quid if you look around a bit. Right now 125 is a bit more typical. Either way, it's very affordable. If you want something with a bit more speed, they even do a brushless version for about 200. Being an RTR, there's not much other than the essentials in the box, but let's have a quick look anyway. First, of course, there's the truck itself, but we'll have a look at that in a minute. Underneath, there's a nice packet of silica gel. Strangely, there's a cardboard box with nothing in it. I can only imagine it's there to prop up the chassis so it's not bobbing up and down during shipping. In the bag, we've got the paperwork and a charger, and the big box at the end has the transmitter. Now it's an eTronics 2-channel unit and no doubt perfectly serviceable. Almost all the 2.5 gig radios are pretty much good enough these days. While we've got a wide angle on the camera, let's have a look over the chassis. First thing, that doesn't really matter for the truck, but there's very little plastic packaging. Other than the bubble wrap around the transmitter, the rest is all cardboard and very recyclable. Nice to see. Before we can get a feel for the truck, there's a zip tie around the rear axle holding it up for shipping. We just need to cut it, and that's a large amount of the prep work done. The body's held on with 4 body clips rather than fancy clipless designs that we see on the expensive kits these days, but that's okay. It does mean that we can easily use bodies from other trucks that share the same chassis, such as the Veta Karoo, which would turn the truck into a short course. The included battery is a 1800 mAh 6-cell NiMi. Just enough to get the truck running, certainly good enough. But since we've got lots of Lipos here, we're going to go straight into converting the truck. At the moment, the ESC has a Tamiya connector on, so all we need to do is swap it for an XT60 and enable the low voltage cutoff. Another little thing, the antenna's floating around a bit, and I assume there's going to be some antenna tube in one of the packets somewhere. Right, in the bag then, we've got the charger. Now that is a charger in the loosest sense, but it should do the job. However, it's going to take 2 or 3 hours to charge the included battery. So if you're planning on running the truck more than once in a day, you really need to invest in a good multi-chemistry charger that will do at the very least NiMi and preferably Lipo. That way you'll be able to recharge in under an hour, and if you step up to Lipos, you'll be ready to go. In fact, I'd recommend definitely getting a proper charger and not even trying to use the included one. Next we've got the antenna tube and the bind plug. We'll have a quick play with them later. Paperwork next, and here's an update for the charger that says it will take 3.5 hours to charge the included pack from flat. Who's got time for that? Next we've got the 2 books. One's the instruction manual and the other has a parts listing. In the parts book we've got exploded diagrams which always make repairs a lot easier. Also, the parts are listed with their part numbers, something that's often left out on the cheap kits. Being distributed in the UK by CML, just about every model shop in the country can get the parts. Many even keep them in stock, and failing that, they're easily available online. Being a well laid out, ready to run, there's nothing really to learn in the manual if you've built a few trucks before. However, if it's your first truck, everything's explained in huge detail with nice clear pictures. I'm quite impressed. Back to the chassis, and we need to install the antenna tube. Now it just slips over the antenna and presses down into the radio box. Now you might get away with coiling it up inside the box, but getting it up high and straight will get the best from the radio. For the steering, we've got a solid servo arm, a nice solid looking linkage. For the steering, we've got a solid servo arm, a nice solid looking linkage that drives the bell crank steering. And because it's a basher, the truck does have a steering servo saver integrated into the bell crank. A nice basic design, but it would have been nice if it had an adjustable tension like a 1/8 scale buggy. The servo itself does say it's waterproof, so it should really have O-ring seals, but whether it does or not we'll find out when we run it. The rest of the front end is typical 1/8 buggy, there's adjustable turnbuckles and a nice pair of metal dampers. On the other side of the chassis we've got the brushed motor. I believe it's a 15-turn 550, so it should have a good bit of oomph, but nothing like the brushless. The ESC looks a lot like the Hobby King X-Car 45. Not an amazing ESC, but it will do the job. We've got a few of those already. At the back we've got a lot of plastic. Now it does feel nice and solid, but if anything's going to let go it's going to be something back here. There's a nice steel anti-roll bar which should keep things stable. The drive shaft's plastic, which isn't great. The slider's okay, but I think the yokes are going to give way before very long. Before we can test the truck, we need some AA's in the transmitter. Now there's a strange plastic bar that makes it tricky to get them in, but if you pull it, it just pops out. Not sure why it's there really. Unfortunately, the transmitter does need 8 AA's, so we'll go as far as testing it just to make sure there's nothing wrong, then we'll swap it out for a GT3C with its built-in battery. When powering it on, we get a couple of LEDs alongside the steering rate and trim knobs. As far as basic radios go, it's just fine. Next we need some power for the truck. Now I'm going to assume that the included battery isn't charged, so rather than charge it, I'm just going to use a different 6L9i that I know has a bit of charge in it. The battery sits on the back and uses a couple of Velcro straps to keep it in. The nice thing is those straps are well oversized, so square hardcase Lipo should fit quite easily, and if you upgrade the ESC, I'm fairly sure a 3S Lipo would fit fine too. So with the truck lifted off the bench, we can turn it on. Now, while still holding it, we can give the steering a quick test, which sounds just fine. No stiffness, very nice. And of course, we need to try the throttle. Well, that sounds okay too. A little bit sharp on the throttle response maybe, but this is a speedy truck rather than a crawler, so it should still be quite usable. So, now we know there's no terminal sounds coming from the truck, we can swap some bits around. So we can avoid using 8 AA's in the transmitter, we're going to swap for this GT3C. We'll only be using 2 channels, the steering and throttle, but that's okay. We just need to swap the receiver and bind it. Now the lid on the receiver box is held in with 2 screws, so we need a 2mm Allen key to remove them. Inside the box we find the receiver. That does look rather familiar. It's branded eTronics, but it looks a lot like a FlySky. Actually, so does the transmitter, so it shouldn't really come as much of a surprise. There's a good chance all we need to do is bind the receiver to the GT3C without having to swap any of the wiring. All we need to do then is plug the bind plug that came with the truck into the channel 3 connector on the receiver. You can fiddle about with the button, but I always find the plug a bit easier. Next we turn on the truck. This time the red LED on the receiver should start flashing to show that it's in bind mode. On the transmitter we need to hold the bind button and turn it on. The red LED on the receiver should stop flashing to show that it's bound. To return to normal mode we need to turn off the receiver and remove the plug. The transmitter can stay on, but I usually power cycle it anyway just in case. Now when you turn the truck on, it should work with the GT3C. Well, the steering's backwards, but that's an easy fix. We just need to reverse the channel on the transmitter. And it looks like the throttle's backwards too. It's important to turn the truck off when swapping them round, for the throttle especially. Otherwise there's a good chance the truck will take off all by itself when you reverse the channel. Now if we test it again, everything should work correctly. Okay, next we're going to address the waterproofness. Now the servo says it's waterproof. The ESC doesn't actually say anything, but I'm fairly sure it is. The real issue is the receiver box. Now it looks nice enough, but there's a small hole that lines up with where the antenna comes out of the receiver. The antenna tube's going to leak a bit too, but the real problem is the huge hole on the back of the box that the servo wires come through. In anything more than light splashes, there's a real risk of filling it up with water, which really wouldn't do the receiver any good at all. The fix is a good dose of silicon sealant, or instant gasket. This stuff is really meant for oily places on a full-size engine, but it's all I've got that hasn't already set in the tube. It'll do the job though. We need to remove the lid again and run a bead around the lip on the bottom half of the box. When you refit the lid, it's going to squeeze out all the excess, making a fairly good seal. You can't really use too much within reason. Any excess can be wiped away nice and cleanly. Next, with the lid back on, we need to spin the chassis around and fill the hole where the servo wires come out. For access, it does help a lot to remove the battery tray. It's only held on with 2 screws, so it's really no bother. Now we can get the nozzle right into the hole and start filling. We want the silicone to make a nice plug, making sure we get all around the wires and right to the edges of the hole. If you don't seal up the box, the first time you go through a puddle that's a bit deeper than you thought, the receiver's going for a bath. Next, so we can use Lipos, I'm going to swap the connector on the ESC for an XT60. Now there's plenty of guides around for changing connectors, so I'm not going to cover it here. I will mention though, that if you come across this solder and think it's going to be worth a try as it's nice and cheap, don't. I'm not sure what they've used for flux, but it really doesn't work. It's like trying to solder with cake icing or frosting. Stick with the proper multi-core, now branded Loctite. It's not cheap, but it's far nicer to work with. One last thing, now we're set up for Lipos, we need to make sure we've got the low voltage cutoff enabled. Now it's a little cryptic in the instructions with the do, re, mi's, but in essence on power up we want it to beep twice, then play its little tune. If we connect up a Lipo and turn it on, we hear a single beep, then do, re, mi. That means the low voltage and the thermal cutoffs are disabled. To enable the cutoffs, all we need to do is hold the little button on the ESC and turn it on. Keep holding the button until there's 2 beeps, then let go. Well, it played the do, re, mi too, so let's see what happens when we turn it off and on again. Well, we have the 2 beeps, so it's good to go. It's all very sensitive at low speed, but that's not really what this truck's for. Once we get it outside, it's all going to make more sense. And speaking of outdoors, here we are out in the woods. Now we're going to start fairly tame, some small jumps and attempted climbs to get a feel for the truck before moving on to some small ramps, then some big ramps. Lastly, there's some sliding around on the flat to give you a good idea of the stability. Overall, I'm quite impressed by the balance of the truck. It does fly very well. Some of the really big ramps were a bit much for the top speed, but even so, the middle-sized ramps work rather nicely. It would be tempting to add 3S and a brushless motor, and it would be very quick, but equally, I don't think you'd ever manage a whole battery without breaking something, even after the upgrades. With a bit more low-speed control, it would make a good trail/basher hybrid, and for the amount I paid for it, I'm more than happy, so far at least, but it's only been run once. Anyway, thanks for watching, like if you like, subscribe if you haven't, and by all means, leave a message down below. Bye guys!